Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. Have you ever been so mad at your HOA you decided to get even with a can of neon orange paint? They destroyed my new fence to put up a sign, so I turned my fence into a giant billboard invoicing them for rent. And that was only phase 1 of my plan. I'm not the kind of neighbor who likes drama. I pay my dues on time, I keep my lawn cut short enough that you could eat off it, and I've read the HOA bylaws front to back at least twice. Not because I like rules, but because I like knowing exactly where the lines are. I'd rather spend a Sunday afternoon knowing my rights than spend a year in a dispute I wasn't prepared for. My house sits at what you'd call the entry point of the neighborhood. When you walk in from the main road and head toward the community park, you pass right along the side of my property. There's a walking path there, maybe 8 feet wide, and then my side fence runs the whole length of it. Because of where the house sits, the fence is probably the most visible stretch of private property in the entire neighborhood. Anyone walking to the park sees it, anyone walking back sees it. It's effectively the face of my property to most of the community, which is partly why I wanted it to look good. For years, that fence was the original wood one that came with the house. Old, gray, half-rotted in some spots. A couple of the pickets had warped badly enough that they'd come loose from the rails, and one section near the back corner had pulled away from a post completely after a bad storm 2 winters ago. I'd repaired what I could with a few screws and some wood treatment, but there was only so much you could do with lumber that had been sitting outside for 15 or 20 years. Earlier this year, I finally got tired of looking at it and started pricing out replacements. I looked at standard wood, vinyl, aluminum, and composite. The wood would have been cheapest, but I'd already learned my lesson there. Vinyl looked fine, but a few neighbors had it, and the panels had started to chalk and discolor after a few years in the sun. Aluminum was solid, but didn't give me the look I wanted. I went with composite, dark gray heavy-duty panels with a clean flat surface, the kind of thing that looks like it belongs on a commercial property rather than a residential one. It was not cheap. The final bill came out to just over $9,000, and that was with a contractor who gave me a fair price because I'd used him before for some deck work. The fence company offered a 10-year warranty on the panels, but there was a condition in the warranty language I remember reading carefully. It stated that the warranty was void on any panel that had hardware or fasteners installed by a third party. Made sense when you think about it. Drilling into composite the wrong way, with the wrong hardware, can fracture the material internally even if it looks fine on the surface. I remember thinking when it went up that it looked genuinely sharp. My neighbor across the street actually came over just to say she wished her HOA would let her do something similar. A few people walking past on the path stopped to look at it. The HOA board president herself drove by slowly one afternoon that week, which I noticed but didn't think much of at the time. I stood there feeling pretty good about the decision. That feeling lasted about 6 weeks. I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday morning when I heard drilling. Not light drilling, not the kind your neighbor does putting up a shelf. This was a sustained industrial sound, the kind of sound you hear when someone is sinking lag bolts into something that is meant to stay. It had a rhythm to it, drill for several seconds, stop, drill again, like whoever was doing it was working through a checklist of spots. At first I figured it was someone doing yard work nearby. Leaf blowers, weed trimmers, the usual Saturday sounds, sometimes they blend together. I gave it a few minutes. The sound didn't stop. It also seemed close. Closer than a neighbor's backyard would account for. I walked to the window that faces the side of the house and looked out toward the fence and didn't see anything obviously wrong from that angle. So I went to the front door, opened it, and walked around the side of the house to the path. There were 2 guys in work clothes out there. One was holding the drill, the other was steadying a large glass-fronted board against my fence panels while his coworker drove screws through the frame directly into my composite. The board was maybe 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall with a dark metal frame around the glass front and a cork backing inside. On the fence itself, at another point maybe 10 feet down, a third screw was already seated with a metal sign on it that said something about pet waste disposal. Another sign next to it was a no parking marker. Both were mounted with hardware that had gone straight through my fence pickets. I stood there for a second just processing what I was seeing. The lag bolts they were using were heavy-duty, the kind rated for structural applications. Those weren't going in shallow. They were likely seated 2 or 3 inches into the composite panel core. I stood there for a second just processing what I was seeing. Then I said, pretty calmly I thought, that they needed to stop what they were doing right now because that was my fence. The guy with the drill looked up and told me they were installing a community notice board authorized by the HOA. He said it in the tone of someone who fully expected that to end the conversation. I told him again, slower this time, that the fence was my private property and that anything bolted to it required my permission, which I had not given. He shrugged and said he just went where the work order sent him. His partner added that the HOA had told them this was a community perimeter structure. I took a few photos of what they'd already done. 2 lag bolts had already been driven through the main panel where the board was mounted. The glass-framed cork board was now physically attached to my fence. There were 2 smaller metal signs a few feet down that had their own screws sunk into the pickets. I told them very clearly that the job needed to stop, that they should not touch anything else, and that I would be in contact with whoever sent them. The guy with the drill shrugged again and they started packing up. I think the work order was already done from their perspective. The board was up. I stood there for another minute looking at the holes in my brand new fence. Inside the glass-fronted board, pinned to the cork, was a printout reminding residents that any property alterations or exterior modifications required advance approval from the board. I actually laughed out loud at that. That afternoon, I sent a message to the HOA board through the management portal asking who had authorized the installation on my fence, noting that it was private property. I kept the tone completely neutral. I just wanted to know who was responsible and what the process had been. The board president got back to me the next day. I'll just call her the president because that's what she was. Her response was about 3 sentences. She said the fence ran along the community pathway and therefore represented a perimeter structure that the HOA considered a community asset. She said the board had voted to improve neighborhood communication by installing the notice board there. Then she told me not to obstruct community business. I read that a couple of times. I wrote back one more message. I kept it short. I told her I understood her position and just wanted to confirm something for my records. I asked whether the HOA was claiming full ownership and maintenance responsibility for the notice board structure that had been installed. I expected her to hedge, to say something vague about shared responsibility or community interest. Instead, she wrote back within the hour. She said yes, the board considered the structure to be HOA property. She told me to move on. I saved that email, I printed it out, I put it in a folder. Then I called a surveyor. Here is something I should mention about my fence that I had known when I bought the house but had never really needed to care about until this moment. The fence did not sit exactly on the property line, it sat 6 inches inside it. When the previous owners built the original fence, they had placed it slightly inward from the legal boundary. This is actually pretty common. People do it intentionally so that maintenance is easier, or sometimes they just get the measurements slightly wrong and nobody cares enough to fix it. Either way, when I replaced the fence, I kept it in the same position as the old one. The surveyor came out, did his work, and confirmed what I already suspected. My fence was entirely on my property. In fact, there was a 6-inch strip of my land between the fence and the actual boundary line. The walking path itself was on HOA-maintained land, but the moment you stepped to the fence, you were touching my property. He gave me a formal survey report with the measurements documented, the property pins identified, and a diagram showing the fence placement relative to the legal boundary. I added this to the folder. Over the next few days, I started reading through the HOA's own insurance documents, which they were required to make available to members. I'm not going to pretend I understood all of it, but I understood enough. One section described what the HOA's general liability coverage applied to, and there was specific language about structures. The coverage applied to common areas and HOA-maintained assets. It explicitly excluded coverage for unauthorized structures placed on private land without the property owner's written consent. The board president had, in writing, claimed that the notice board was HOA property. The notice board was on my private property. The board president had not obtained my written consent before installation. So the HOA had just taken ownership on paper of an unauthorized structure on private land, which meant their own insurance policy didn't cover it. If the board collapsed or the glass broke and hurt someone or anything happened at that location, they were exposed. I added the relevant insurance pages to the folder. At this point, I had the folder, I had the survey, I had the email. and I had a growing sense that the president had handed me everything I needed without realizing it. I thought about how to proceed for a few days. I could have called a lawyer immediately. I could have sent a formal cease and desist. Instead, I decided to do something a little more creative first. The notice board had a glass front with a small gap at the bottom of the frame. The HOA hadn't locked it yet, or maybe the lock wasn't on the work order. Either way, I could see how items had been slid into the board from the outside. The printouts inside were just paper pinned to cork behind the glass. I printed 2 documents. The first was a notice of trespass, addressed to the HOA board, citing the survey report, noting that a structure had been installed on private property without consent, and providing my contact information for any questions. The second was a land lease invoice. I set the daily rate at $100 per day, backdated to the day of installation. The invoice stated that by claiming ownership of the structure, the HOA had entered into an implied commercial lease agreement for the use of my private fence surface. I was billing accordingly. I slid both documents through the gap at the bottom of the glass frame and watched them settle onto the cork behind all the other notices. The next day I drove by on my way out and could see both pages clearly visible through the glass right alongside the pet waste reminder. I have to be honest, that part felt pretty good. Within 2 days, I had a voicemail from the president. She was not happy. She said my documents were inappropriate, that I had no right to bill the HOA for anything, and that she would be bringing this up at the next board meeting. She also said she expected me to remove whatever I had placed inside the notice board. I called her back and left my own message in return. I told her that I couldn't touch the notice board since she had informed me in writing that it was HOA property, not mine. I said any modifications to the board would need to go through the HOA. I also mentioned that if the HOA wanted to dispute the invoice, I was happy to have the conversation in front of a licensed mediator or in small claims court. Then I moved to phase 2. I called the fence contractor who had done the original installation. I explained that I needed the fence refinished and that I wanted a specific treatment done around the area where the notice board was mounted. I asked him to paint a bright border around the board's footprint in a very visible color and to stencil text above it. He asked what color. I said neon orange. He asked what the text should say. I told him. 3 days later, my fence had a crisp orange rectangular border painted around the notice board, and in clean black stenciled letters above it were the words, "Commercial lease space available." I stepped back to look at it from the path. It was perfect. Within about 6 hours, I had a message from the property management company saying the president had asked them to issue me a warning for unauthorized fence modifications that violated community appearance standards. I wrote back and asked them to please send me the bylaw section that restricted homeowners from painting their own private property. I also mentioned that under the appearance standards, any commercial signage required prior approval, and that I had not installed any commercial signage, merely painted my own fence. I also noted that since the board had claimed ownership of the notice board structure, the board was responsible for ensuring that whatever was attached to my fence remained in proper condition. The orange border, I said, was simply helping define where their property ended and mine began. There was no response for a few days. The next board meeting was a Thursday night. I showed up. It was held in the clubhouse and there were maybe 20 residents there. The president was sitting at the table at the front with 2 other board members. She had papers in front of her and she looked like she had been thinking about this conversation for a while. She got through the regular agenda stuff and then announced there was a matter of owner compliance to address. She mentioned that a homeowner had painted their fence in a manner inconsistent with community standards and had made false claims about billing the HOA for community property. She looked at me when she said it. I let her finish. Then I asked to speak and she allowed it because she probably expected me to apologize or get defensive. I stood up and laid things out in a pretty logical order. I told the room that the fence was my private property, confirmed by a professional land survey. I told them that the board president had responded to my inquiry in writing by claiming that the notice board was HOA property. I held up a printed copy of that email. I told them that the paint on my fence was entirely within my rights as a property owner and was not subject to HOA approval because the bylaws only restricted modifications to structures, not surface treatments applied to privately owned wood and composite fencing. Then I put the invoice on the table in front of the board. I said the retroactive storage and encroachment fee currently stood at several $1,000s, depending on how they wanted to calculate the daily rate from the installation date. I told them I was not trying to make anyone's life difficult. I just wanted my fence repaired to its original condition at the HOA's cost, and a formal acknowledgement that the fence was private property. The president started to say something about how the board had the authority to designate community structures in common pathway areas. One of the other board members, the treasurer, I think, put a hand on her arm and asked to pause the meeting. They stepped away from the table and had a conversation near the back wall. I sat down and waited. A couple of residents near me leaned over to ask quiet questions, and I showed them the survey and the email. The board's legal consultant reached out to me 2 days after the meeting. He was professional and direct. He said he had reviewed the email chain, the survey, and the insurance documentation I had included in a follow-up message I sent to the management company. He told me his assessment was clear and that the board had made an error. We talked through the situation for maybe 20 minutes. He acknowledged that the installation had been done without owner consent. He acknowledged that the board president's email created a documented claim of ownership that had real liability implications. He said that if OP pursued litigation, the HOA would be looking at the cost of the fence repairs, the survey reimbursement, potential damages for trespass, and legal fees that would far exceed what it would cost to just fix the fence. He said the board wanted to resolve this without litigation and asked what I was looking for. I told him I wanted 3 things. First, the notice board, the metal signs, and all associated hardware removed by a professional crew at the HOA's expense. Second, the fence panels damaged by the installation replaced in full, which meant new panels at the current retail cost since composite panels couldn't be patched or filled the way wood can. The installer had given me a quote when I asked, and it came to 2 panels at just over $400 each plus labor. Third, reimbursement for the survey fees I had paid out of pocket, which came to just under $300. He asked about the invoice, the one I had slid into the notice board with the daily lease rate. I told him I would waive the accumulated daily fees if the other 3 items were handled completely and promptly, and if the board provided a written acknowledgement that the fence was private property and that no future attachments would be made without my written consent. He said he would get back to me. He called again the next morning and said the board had agreed to all 3 terms. He asked if I could send over the exact panel specifications so the crew could order the right materials. I sent him the fence company's product sheet within the hour. The crew showed up on a Saturday, same day of the week the original installers had shown up. I set up a lawn chair at the edge of my driveway with a cup of coffee and watched. The process was more complicated than putting it up. The lag bolts had to come out carefully, then the holes had to be addressed, and because composite panels don't just accept a patch the way wood does, 2 full panels had to be removed and replaced. The crew was professional and did not seem particularly happy about the job, but they did it right. By early afternoon, the board was gone, the metal signs were gone, and 2 new fence panels were in place matching the others. The orange paint had to be removed too, which required a specific treatment for composite surfaces. That took another hour. By about 2 in the afternoon, my fence looked almost exactly like it had the day after the original installation. I walked the full length of it and checked the new panels. The contractor doing the repair work actually handed me a written confirmation that the work had been done to manufacturer standards and the warranty on those 2 panels was intact. I thanked him and went inside. The notice board ended up on a wooden post near the mailboxes at the neighborhood entrance. It looked a little rough out there in comparison to how sharp it had looked mounted on my composite fence. The post was slightly crooked and someone had already put a sticker on the bottom edge of the glass. But that was the HOA's problem. I got the written acknowledgement from the board about a week later. It was a short document, maybe half a page, signed by the board secretary since the president apparently could not bring herself to sign it. The document stated that the fence on the west side of my property was privately owned and that any future use of or attachment to the fence required written consent from me as the property owner. I got the survey reimbursement as a check from the management company. I had a frame at home I wasn't using. I put the acknowledgement document in it and hung it in the hallway near the back door. It's been about 4 months since all of that wrapped up. I haven't received a single HOA notice about my property. Not about the lawn, not about the fence, not about anything. A couple of my neighbors have mentioned to me that the president brought up my name at a recent meeting while discussing bylaw enforcement, and that 2 other board members told her they thought we should leave that particular homeowner alone. I keep my lawn the way I always have. I keep the fence clean. I know exactly where my property line is. The bylaws, by the way, have a section reminding homeowners that placing any structure on a neighbor's property without written consent constitutes trespass and may be subject to civil action. I read that section pretty carefully when I first moved in. I'm glad I did. For anyone going through something similar, a few things that actually helped me. Get the survey done first, before anything else. Once you have that piece of paper with official stamps on it, everything else becomes much cleaner. Anyone can argue about what they think the property line is. Nobody can argue with a licensed surveyor's documentation. Read your HOA's own insurance policy if you can get it. They are required to disclose this to members in most states. You may find that their coverage has limitations they haven't thought about, especially if they try to claim ownership of something they haven't properly documented. When someone in a position of authority makes a claim in writing, let them. Don't talk them out of it. Don't correct them immediately. Save the document and think about what that claim actually means for them before you respond. The orange paint was honestly the most fun part of the whole thing. I will not pretend otherwise. The fence looks great, by the way, even better now that the panels are uniform again. The next one is a malicious compliance story. If you've seen my other posts in the subreddit, they all seem to do something with trucking and diesel mechanics, which was my entire adult careers. I think truck driving is mostly about compliance and malicious compliance. I hope this fits here. In high school, I went to tech school for auto mechanics. Since I was little, I always wanted to be a mechanic. Upon graduation, I went directly to work as a mechanic. The work didn't bother me so much, but I hated the shop. One day I realized the best part of my day was the test drive. So I thought being a truck driver would be the perfect job for me. So I worked towards that goal. Soon after my 20th birthday, I got a job driving a truck. I loved the open road. Back then, Pennsylvania used the Class 1, 2, 3 license system. Class 1 was for 18-wheelers. Class 2 was for large trucks over 30,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. Class 3 was passenger vehicles. The company I worked for had 2 delivery trucks and I was driver number 2. All was great till... About 3.5 years after I started, Pennsylvania decided to go with the federal commercial driver's license. The classes all worked the same, with differences. Instead of 1, 2, 3, it is now ABC. Class A is 18-wheelers, Class B is all other trucks over 27,000 pounds, and Class C was passenger vehicles. Class 3 and Class C vehicles only needed a regular driver's license to drive them. All other classes required extra testing to get the proper license. Once you had your truck permit, you had to be able to get a truck and licensed driver to test drive and practice with. Then take the driving test, followed by the written test to get your license. I have a problem. I don't know another CDL driver, nor anyone who will allow me to borrow a truck to take the test. My only other option is to enroll into a truck driving school. At 20, living on my own, that was not an option. Our trucks were originally rated at Class 3 because they had no air brakes and weighed 28,000 pounds. The company chose this route so they could pay drivers less. However, with the federal class system, our trucks are now Class B, requiring a CDL. So the characters. There is me, OP, a 20M truck driver, Fred 40-ish M, the company part owner, John 30-ish M, my manager under Fred. Pennsylvania had a 3-month deadline to get your CDL, or you cannot drive. One day John asks me, "Are you going to get your CDL?" I say, "I don't know. Is the company going to pay for it?" "I don't know," said John. "Let me talk to Fred." At this point, I am the only driver they have. John and I work together well. I have a great working relationship with everyone in the company, and our customers as well. Well, everyone but Fred. Fred bought into the company a year ago. From day one, he had an issue with me. He always assumed I was doing the wrong thing, but never had true cause. Since day one, he would only speak to me if he had to. No small talk, no smile. A month passes, and I do not get an answer one way or the other. Till Fred asks me one day, "Are you going to get your CDL?" I say, "Are you paying for it?" "No," he says. So I reply no as well. Another month goes by, and Fred and I have the same conversation. But this time, Fred asked, "What are you going to do for work?" I looked at him dead in the eye and said, "This isn't the only job." The malicious compliance. What I knew that Fred apparently didn't realize was that in just over 2 weeks they could not deliver product unless they hire someone for a lot more money to drive. So they were going to have to comply to my demand or lose 85% of their business. With almost 2 weeks to go till the deadline, John says to me, "On Saturday, take the company pickup, drive to Harrisburg, and get your permit. You will be paid for your time." I found a few weeks earlier that if I drove the same truck for 3 years, I could get a waiver of the permit. As long as the company owner is willing to sign an affidavit that I drove there 3 years or more, I could skip all of the driving portion, get my permit, then take the written test and get my CDL. I did not tell Fred that. Instead, I went to the other owner of the company and had him sign. Saturday comes, I get on the road at 4 a.m. to be in Harrisburg, DMV by 5:30 or 6 a.m. When I get there, I am surprised. The line for the DMV runs out the door and around the block. I estimate when they open at 7 a.m., I will be about 500th in line. It took another 2.5 hours, but I walked out with my permit. Now for the test. To Pennsylvania's credit, they had a firehouse in every county as a temporary CDL testing site, due to the volume of people who needed testing. I tried to get into 3 different testing sites, but they were packed and closed before I navigated the line to get in. After that, my office called around to reserve a spot for me. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, I get a call to get to a particular testing site in 1 hour, and I have a seat to take the test. The problem, I was an hour and a half away from the site. Well, I floored it, bent a few laws, but I got to the site as they were closing the doors and got in. To get a CDL, you must pass the general truck test and the air brake test. Then you can take the test for endorsements on your license. They include tanker, school bus, passenger bus, double buses, think long bus that bends in the middle, double and triple trailers, commonly seen behind FedEx and UPS trucks, and lastly hazmat, for trucks hauling hazardous materials over 50 pounds. I was there to take 2 tests. I took all but one. I took every test but hazmat. I was the last person to walk in and sit down with my test. I was the first to leave. As I was walking out, I heard one guy say to his friend, "I guess he failed." In the back of the room was a computer that graded your test and gave you the score right then. 80 and above to pass. Fingers crossed my test was ran through the computer. I passed all tests with my lowest score being an 87, each test scored individually. That Saturday, same deal. Take the pickup, drive to Harrisburg, get my license. But this time I left at 3 a.m., and good thing I did. This time I was about 300th in line. It still took about 2 hours once I got inside. By the time I came out with my license, the line was over 1,500 people and growing. All in all. Over that 2-week period, I got about 25 hours of overtime, a CDL, and a pay raise. I left the company about a year later. I continued to drive trucks for the next 11 years, before becoming a diesel tech. Having a CDL was very helpful through my diesel career. In most cases, having the CDL got me to the front of the line and slash or increased my starting salary. In some shops I worked, I was the only tech legal to drive a truck on test drives. The next one is an entitled people story. A long time ago, I made a post about an entitled boyfriend demanding to see his girlfriend's credit card statements from the bank where I worked. During the back and forth in the comments, I promised to provide some more bat crap crazy bank tales. I hereby present a few of them. At the time, I worked for one of the big 4 banks in Canada. Yes, I know there are 5 now. Initially, I worked at an experimental boutique branch. The company was putting non-cash branches with bank machines into larger stores. In my case, a Walmart. We were tasked with opening as many accounts as possible. One of my new accounts would be memorable. Within days of opening his account, he made an empty envelope deposit of several $100s. I contacted him and he claimed to have accidentally forgotten the check. I told him, technically that was illegal, but didn't ask to have his account closed or him charged. He covered the funds he'd illegally withdrawn. I explained that from now on, 100% of his non-cash deposits would held until they cleared. He apologized and said he understood. A few days later, on my day off, I got a hysterical call from a coworker on her first shift alone. The same man had made a deposit in the cash machine and was raging at her because he couldn't get the cash from the check deposit. He insisted that I had told him that he would get the full amount of any deposited check instantly. I could hear him screaming at her, so I asked her to give him the phone. He demanded that I either give him 100% of the check's value in cash or return the check. I asked him if he remembered our conversation about the empty envelope deposit. He said that had been a mistake, but he was entitled to his check money. Now! He went off the deep end and said he was grabbing a crowbar from his car and removing his check from the machine. Then he said he would beat me with the crowbar. He cycled through the same string of arguments. We were stealing his money. This was illegal. I was a lying idiot. He was getting his check or cash or someone was going to pay until he was out of steam and hung up. When I reported all this to head office, I expected them to circle the wagons and protect their employees by pressing charges. Nope. They didn't even close his account. I never saw our new hire again, though. I left the job shortly afterwards, but was hired by a main branch of the same bank within a few weeks. Here are some representative examples of entitled customers from that location. One gentleman called to complain about a large deposit being held. Yes, he understood when he opened the account he'd agreed to that, but he thought the requirement would be automatically waived because of his high status in the community. He went on to explain why he was so esteemed. He was a VP at one of the larger employers in our community. He donated to charities. He volunteered. He had even been featured in our local paper. How dare we fail to recognize his magnificence? I had to politely listen to this diatribe and then transfer him to the manager, who had to hear everything all over again. Sorry, monsieur, but you are not that special when we have millions of customers. Next adventure. In the late 90s in Toronto, someone dropped a tool into the wrong machine in a building housing all the servers for the big 4 banks in Canada. Suddenly, they were all crippled. Almost all normal transactions were impossible. We're all trying to keep busy when in comes a young woman who wants me to change her password. Now, I had a lot of downtime in my position, so I learned how the different information structures in different segments of the company connected. It was like a 3-dimensional video game. So I knew that if I entered her information into one system, burrowed down and went sideways into a yet another system, I could change her password. I explained the outage and said normally I would have had to turn her away, but said I had a backup option that would take longer. I worked my voodoo on the systems and got her password changed in about 5 minutes versus the normal 30 seconds. I handed her card back with a big smile, anticipating a grateful thank you. Instead, she spit at me, called me a stupid cute, and threw a pen at my head. My many years in customer service had given me great reflexes, so I dodged it. Just another day working in the bank. Another day, another crazy customer. Our branch was always open late on Thursday nights because many companies paid Thursdays. I came to hate those days because often the employees would have a few drinks before coming into the bank. My last 2 incidents are from those Thursday nights. The first involved a very handsome young man came up to my counter and asked a question. I couldn't understand what he said and asked him to repeat himself. Instead of doing that, he came around behind the counter and grabbed me in a bear hug. Once he got close, I could smell alcohol and realized he was drunk. I tried to peel him off me, but he must have really needed a hug because he would just not let go. He had his head down, was mumbling something, and had his arms wrapped tightly around my waist. By now, he had twirled me towards the front of the bank like we were having a drunk waltz. The other employees and customers had noticed my dilemma and were trying to help. One of them managed to convince him to let go. He stopped, raised his head, gave me a blurry look, and then slugged me in the ribs before staggering out of the bank towards the mall exit. We all shared a WTF glance and then went back to business. Final event. Not sure if most would consider this to be entitled, but I certainly did. It was almost time to lock the doors when a large, rowdy group showed up. They all got in line. Then I noticed one of them seemed to be swaying, gently back and forth like a tree in the wind. I was concerned, thinking he was going to faint. When he spoke, I realized he had been drinking and guessed that explained the movement. I kept an eye on him because we can't legally serve people who are too drunk. Then I noticed his pants darkening near his crotch. The darkness moved down both sides and urine started to puddle on the floor, getting larger. He either pretended or didn't notice it was happening. I silently pondered the life choices I made that led me to a job where I had to watch drunks piss themselves on a Thursday night. Our manager took one for the team and cleaned it up. Thanks, Norm. There were other notable moments of entitlement, but these really stuck in my memory. A few clarifying points. Neither the boutique branch in the Walmart nor the main branch had security. I didn't call the cops because none of the incidents resulted in serious injury or damage. This took place in the late 90s in northern Alberta, Canada. I am not, nor will I ever be, AI. Anyway, thank you for watching.